So, before learning about any civilization, it's really important that you understand the geography of the area. That's what the land is like there and why people might have settled there. So, we're going to start in ancient Egypt, and you need to understand the geography of ancient Egypt. So, first thing, here's a map of what ancient Egypt would have been like. It has been divided into two parts, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. This is where it gets a little confusing, and so you're going to have to kind of flip it in your head because Lower Egypt is up at the top, and Upper Egypt is down at the bottom. So, the reason that is, I'll turn on my pointer so that'll help you here, is because the Nile River, which is this that runs right through here, runs upwards into the Mediterranean Sea. And so the top of the river is Upper Egypt, all the way up to Lower Egypt. So, barriers. One of the things that makes Egypt a great place to settle is that it had natural barriers. You want a barrier because if your land is going to get attacked, you need a way to find protection. So, the first natural barrier they had were mountains down in the south. This makes it difficult for the enemy to get across. Then there's deserts. We all know about the Sahara Desert and all that. All this land here is desert. And especially back in the time of ancient Egypt, if your enemy is 300 miles away, it's going to take days or weeks for them to get to you. And they're not going to want to cross the desert because they don't have enough water or supplies to do that. And so it would weaken your enemy to have to cross that far. So being on the other side of a desert really is its own natural barrier. So it kind of led to this Egyptian culture where not many people could get there. And so they had their own way of doing things that maybe would be unlike some of the other civilizations. But they weren't completely isolated because they did have access to all this water here, especially the Mediterranean Sea, which goes up to Greece and Italy. And over here, you have access to Mesopotamia. So they could still trade through this area. So the Nile River was actually Egypt's most important resource. Any civilization that you can think of has to settle near water because you need water for travel, for drinking, for watering your crops, for so many things. And so this river runs straight through Egypt, and it's where all the cities, if you look back at that map, where all the cities settled right near the river. And it actually kept Egypt connected to other civilizations. Like I said, if you lived in Upper Egypt, you could get on a boat or get in your boat, go up the Nile River to the Mediterranean, and then you could get to all these other civilizations. Notice again all these major cities that are right along the Nile, they're not way over here. So, some basic facts. The Nile River is actually about 4,160 miles long, and it is the longest river in Africa and in the world. It is the longest river in the world. It's usually associated with Egypt, although it does run throughout much of Africa. In fact, only about a fifth of the river itself is in Egypt. So there's still 78% of the river that runs through the rest of Africa, but everyone always thinks of it as associated with Egypt because it was so central to ancient Egypt and the culture there. So you have the White and the Blue Nile, technically. So there are two main rivers that flow into the Nile. You have Egypt up here. This is the section of the Nile that runs through Egypt. You can see how far it runs down into Africa. But it does split up right here. And you have the Blue Nile and the White Nile. So the White Nile starts at Lake Victoria, which is actually, I believe, the largest lake in the world. And it comes up through here. That's where it meets the Blue River, or the Blue Nile, and it goes all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea. The Blue Nile starts at Lake Tana in Ethiopia. The White Nile is a lot bigger than the Blue Nile. I mean, you can see how much farther down it goes. And the White Nile only contributes about 15% of the flow. So even though this is a bigger river, it contributes less water to this section. And the Blue Nile contributes the other 85%. So, flooding. There was a huge problem with flooding. The snow would melt in the Ethiopian mountains, and then you'd get all this heavy rain in the summer. And so every year, the Nile would flood into Egypt. And at first, this was a huge problem in Egypt because the flooding was so bad. If all your cities are along the river, people are losing their houses, their crops are dying, people were dying. And they couldn't find a way out of the cycle for the longest time. And then they started studying it. People started recording what time of year does it flood? How often is it flooding? What happens when it floods? What are the signs beforehand? And what they found was that the Nile was flooding at about the same time every single year. And it would start around June and end near September. So the Egyptians came up with a name for that flooding period, and it was called Akhet, which is the inundation. So then they knew what to expect and they could start preparing for it. So as they planned for this flood, they started preparing for it to start in June. And the first thing they did was they had to make sure nothing important was exactly on the banks of the river. So when I say cities are next to the river, they're not right up, like houses aren't right up touching the river. They're going to be set out a little bit. Then, after the water level would go back down, they would immediately start planting their new crops. That allowed for fresh, good soil to come up onto the land. So basically, when the water floods, it comes up on the land. You have this nutrient rich soil that comes in. It's watered the soil. It's the perfect time for planting so that your crops will thrive. So as soon as the water level goes back down, they plant their crops and the harvest comes before it floods again. So they found a way to make the flood work for them and their needs. Instead of focusing on what they lose, they find a way to plan around it. So there were several benefits of the Nile. The first is that they could catch a lot of fish. They had spears, nets, and they could even watch what the birds would do. And where birds were circling, that's where the fish were. So they would come out. You can kind of see down here. This is obviously a cartoon. I don't think it would have been exactly like this, but you get the idea. So obviously, they find fish for food. It also is transportation, as I talked about earlier. They could sail up the Nile or boat up the Nile into the Mediterranean, and it was perfect for trade. Even between the cities in Egypt, they could trade with each other. It also was important because it provided protection from an attack. So, if people wanted to invade Egypt, they had to cross the Nile River first. And in some places, the Nile River is super wide. So, all it would take was for Egyptians to stand along the edge here with spears. And as you're trying to swim or wade across the water, and you're not very fast in water, we all know this. Even the fastest people running in water are not as fast as people running on land. So as you're trying to get through the water, you're kind of defenseless, and the Egyptians could just stand there and throw spears at you. So then, if you did make it all the way across, odds are you're going to be very tired. Walking through water is an aerobic activity. You can take classes at a gym just for that because it is exhausting work. So it would weaken the enemy. And then, as I mentioned earlier, trade. You could travel up and down and trade with others. And this person right here is happy. He was the god of the Nile. And so the Egyptians felt that if you honored the gods, if you were good to the gods would be good to you. And obviously, they need to know that the flooding is not going to demolish everything and that it's going to be good for a crop. So it was very important for them to honor this god, and so that he would bring peace to the land and fertile crops. So that's the information for the geography of Egypt. If you need a quick summary here, the Nile was the most important part of the geography of Egypt because it provided everything that they needed for survival. And the deserts, the mountains, and the Nile were great barriers for protection for the Egyptian people, but they also allowed them to be a little bit more isolated. Even though they could trade with other cultures, they didn't see them as often, so they could form their own Egyptian culture.